Richard Lawson's life was built on secrets. But nothing prepared him for the moment he saw three boys on a crowded street who looked exactly like him. Each shared his sharp jawline, his piercing blue eyes, and even the same nervous habit of tugging at their sleeves. In that instant, the billionaire who believed he controlled every detail of his world felt it all slip away. What began as a strange coincidence would soon unravel into a nightmare of hidden betrayals, forbidden love, and a past he thought was buried forever because the boys weren't strangers at all. They were his children. And their mother was the one woman he had spent years trying to forget. Richard Hale's life looked flawless from the outside. He was one of those men who seemed to have everything, an empire built from nothing, a mansion that stretched across acres of coastal land, cars lined up like trophies, and a reputation that made people whisper in admiration. But beneath the luxury and perfection, there were cracks no one could see. There were things he had buried so deep that even he had almost forgotten them. For years, his focus had been only on business deals, board meetings, and headlines that called him a genius. He rarely thought about his past. Until the day that three boys changed everything. It was a warm afternoon at a charity event in Santa Monica. Richard was there as the guest of honor, surrounded by flashing cameras and journalists trying to catch his every word. He smiled for pictures, shook hands, and made polite small talk. It was the kind of public appearance he had done hundreds of times before. But as he was about to step into his car, something caught his eye at the edge of the crowd. Three boys were playing near the event gates, chasing each other with careless joy, their laughter echoing through the air. It was an ordinary moment, children having fun, but something about them made him freeze. The oldest looked around 12, the middle one maybe 10, and the youngest couldn't have been more than 8. Their clothes were simple, the kind that spoke of modest means. Yet what drew him in wasn't their innocence or their laughter, it was the strange familiarity of their faces. The oldest boy's piercing blue eyes were identical to his own. The youngest had a small dimple on his left cheek that appeared every time he smiled, the same one Richard saw in the mirror every morning. And the middle boy's posture, the confident tilt of his shoulders, looked eerily familiar. It was as if he was watching small versions of himself. He couldn't look away. For a moment the sounds of the crowd disappeared. His heart began to beat faster, and he felt a rush of confusion and disbelief. He thought maybe it was just his imagination. Perhaps he was seeing what he wanted to see. But when one of the boys turned his head fully toward him, the resemblance was undeniable. It was like staring at his own reflection from decades ago. Then, as if sensing his stare, a woman appeared behind them, calling the boys toward her. She looked older than he remembered, her hair tied back, her eyes weary. But when she turned her face toward him, Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He knew her. Even after all these years, he recognized her instantly. Her name was Marisol. She had worked for him 15 years ago, back when his company was just a small startup, and his home was a modest house in Los Angeles. Marisol had been his maid, cleaning and helping with meals when he could barely afford to pay her. She was quiet, kind, and loyal, never asking for much. Then one day she was simply gone. She had left without a word, without taking her last paycheck, without leaving a note. He remembered being surprised, maybe a little disappointed, but not devastated. His life had been moving too fast at that time to pause for anyone. He got married to a socialite soon after, and within a few years he was a billionaire. Marisol faded into memory like a face in a dream. Until now, their eyes met for a brief electric second. Marisol's expression changed instantly from calm to sheer panic. She turned away, grabbing her children by their arms and hurrying them toward the street. Richard stood frozen, unable to react. His driver asked if he was ready to leave, but he didn't hear him. His mind raced through questions he couldn't answer. Why had she left? Were those really his children? Could it even be possible? He wanted to run after her, to ask, but something inside him held back. He had too much to lose, too many eyes watching. He let her go. That night, his mind wouldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boys' faces. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. He tossed and turned, haunted by memories he had tried to forget. He remembered one rainy night years ago, when the power had gone out in his small house. He and Marisol had stayed up by candlelight, talking for hours. It had been harmless, or at least that's what he had told himself back then. But now, the memory felt heavy, sharp with guilt. He remembered her warmth, her laughter, the way she had looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. And now she had 3 boys, each one with a piece of him written into their faces. By morning, his curiosity had turned into something darker. He needed to know the truth. He called one of his private investigators, a man who handled delicate matters discreetly, and asked him to find everything he could about Marisol. The investigator didn't ask questions. He knew better than to pry into his client's personal life. Within 2 days, he returned with a full report. Marisol was living in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles. She worked part-time cleaning offices and lived in a small rented house with her 3 sons. She had no partner, no financial support, and no records of receiving child benefits from any known father. The report was clinical, factual, but to Richard it felt like a punch to the chest. She had struggled all these years while he had built an empire. She had raised 3 boys alone while he had lived in mansions. The guilt began to eat at him. He stared at their photos, taken secretly by the investigator, studying every detail. The eldest boy, Samuel, had a sharp, serious face. The middle one, Elias, had mischievous eyes that reminded him of himself at that age. The youngest, Leo, had a gentle innocence that made his throat tighten. He could see himself in all of them, but he needed real proof. He arranged for a charity outreach program in Marisol's neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for his foundation to sponsor low-income families, so no one suspected anything. Through this cover, he managed to collect DNA samples under the guise of a free health screening for children. He told himself it was necessary, that he needed certainty before confronting her. But deep down, he knew it was cowardice. When the results finally arrived a week later, the envelope sat unopened on his desk for hours. He couldn't bring himself to look. The longer he stared, the heavier it felt, as if the truth inside it could destroy everything he had built. Finally, with trembling hands, he opened it. The words were simple but world-shattering. Asterisk, asterisk, probability of paternity, 99.98%. Asterisk, asterisk, his chest tightened as he read it again and again. All 3 boys were his. Every assumption, every suspicion was now fact. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. His empire, his reputation, his perfect image, all of it now rested on a secret he hadn't even known existed. A secret that, if exposed, could ruin everything. Yet beneath the panic, there was something else, a faint, forgotten feeling, pride, the realization that somewhere in that small house, 3 innocent lives carried his blood. He wasn't just a billionaire or a public figure anymore. He was a father, whether he wanted to be or not. But as that thought settled, another followed close behind. Marisol had kept this from him for 12 long years, and she had vanished once before. He began to wonder what she might do next, and what else she might be hiding. Richard sat in his office long after the city lights outside had faded into the early dawn haze. The DNA report still lay open on his desk, the bold black letters staring back at him like an accusation. He had read it dozens of times through the night, each word sinking deeper until it no longer felt like paper, it felt like judgment. The confirmation of paternity should have brought relief, but instead, it wrapped him in a suffocating mix of guilt and confusion. He couldn't decide what to do next. Confronting Marisol could unravel a scandal that would destroy him, yet doing nothing felt worse. The thought of those 3 boys growing up without knowing the truth clawed at his conscience. As morning broke, Richard found himself replaying old memories that had long been buried beneath years of success. He remembered the small rented home he once lived in, the one Marisol used to clean. She had been gentle, quiet, and far too kind for the world he belonged to now. He remembered how she often brought warmth to those long nights of struggle when his dreams were fragile and money was scarce. Then one day, without warning, she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. He had been so focused on his growing career that he hadn't even looked for her. Now, 12 years later, he was staring at the consequences of that silence. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how unfair life had been to her. While he had climbed to unimaginable heights, she had been fighting to survive. She had raised 3 children alone, carrying a burden that should have been his to share. The weight of that realization made his chest ache. For the first time in his life, Richard felt powerless. He could buy almost anything in the world, but he couldn't buy back time or undo the years she had spent struggling because of him. He decided he couldn't just ignore them. But he also knew he couldn't appear suddenly as their father. His marriage, his corporate image, and his entire public reputation would crumble if the truth came out. The world would not forgive a billionaire for hiding a secret family with a poor maid. The media would feast on it, and his investors would turn on him. Everything he had built would burn overnight. So he needed another way. He began sending financial help anonymously. Through one of his charitable foundations, he arranged monthly deposits into Marisol's account, disguised as scholarship funds for single mothers. He ensured that her rent was covered, her debts quietly erased, and her children enrolled in a better school. He told himself this was enough, that he was making things right. But it wasn't. The more he helped from afar, the more he wanted to see them, to watch them grow, to hear their voices, to be near them, even if they never knew who he was. So he started driving to their neighborhood on weekends, parking far enough away not to be noticed. From the comfort of his car, he watched as the boys played in the small park across the street. He studied their movements, their laughter, the way they looked out for one another. The oldest, Samuel, was protective and serious, already taken on the role of a man far too young. The middle one, Elias, was restless and curious, always climbing trees or chasing stray dogs. The youngest, Leo, stuck close to his mother, clinging to her hand when she walked home from the grocery store. They were bright, happy, despite their modest life, and watching them filled him with an ache he couldn't describe. Sometimes he caught sight of Marisol sitting on the porch, watching her children with a tired smile. There was strength in her eyes, but also exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of sacrifice. She looked nothing like the maid he remembered. Time had left its marks on her, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Richard realized that despite everything, she had done what he never could. She had raised 3 boys on love and resilience, not wealth or power. He admired her for that, even as shame twisted inside him. He began to wonder what she thought of him now. Did she hate him? Did she still remember the man he used to be before the fame and fortune? Or was he just a painful chapter she had closed forever? The questions haunted him, and yet he never found the courage to approach her. He told himself he would wait for the right time, though deep down he knew there might never be one. Then one evening everything changed. He had gone again to the neighborhood, sitting quietly in his car as usual. The boys were playing soccer in the dusty lot behind the houses. Marisol was on the porch, folding laundry. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It should have been another ordinary moment of silent observation, but then a black SUV pulled up in front of Marisol's house. 2 men in suits stepped out, holding papers. He watched as Marisol came forward, visibly tense. The men spoke to her briefly, then handed her the documents. She read them, her hands shaking, and he could see the panic spreading across her face. Richard's gut clenched. Something was wrong. He got out of his car, ready to intervene, but by the time he reached the corner, the SUV was already driving away. Marisol stood frozen, clutching the papers while the boys gathered around her in confusion. She sank onto the porch steps, her shoulders trembling. From where he stood, he couldn't hear what she said, but the despair on her face told him everything. Later that night, Richard learned the truth from his assistant. Marisol's home was part of a redevelopment project that one of his own subsidiary companies had recently acquired. A legal technicality had surfaced, claiming she had no ownership rights to the property. Her eviction notice had already been processed. The company had planned to clear the land for a new construction site, one of his new luxury housing developments. Without realizing it, Richard had become the reason his own children were about to lose their home. The irony struck him like a cruel joke. For all his wealth, all his control, he had managed to hurt the very people he wanted to protect. He ordered his legal team to halt the eviction immediately, but it was too late. The following day, when he sent someone to deliver the news, Marisol and the boys were gone. The house stood empty, the windows covered with boards, the air thick with the dust of sudden departure. The neighbors said they had packed everything overnight and left before dawn. No one knew where they went. Her car was found abandoned near a gas station 2 towns away, but there was no sign of her or the children. The police treated it as a voluntary disappearance, assuming she had fled to avoid legal trouble, but Richard knew better. He could feel it in his bones that this was not simply fear or coincidence. Someone had pushed her to disappear, someone who knew exactly how much was at stake if the truth about those boys came out. Days passed without any leads. The investigator he hired could find nothing. Marisol's bank account went silent, her phone disconnected, her trail vanished completely. The only thing left behind was a faint trace of her scent in that abandoned house of memory that refused to fade. Richard spent sleepless nights replaying every possible scenario in his mind. Had someone threatened her? Had she run to protect the boys from him? Or had something far worse happened? Every theory tormented him, but one thought kept returning with relentless clarity. Someone within his circle must have discovered the truth and acted on their own to make sure the problem disappeared. And that meant the danger wasn't over. Whoever had made Marisol vanish once might do it again to her or to the boys if she ever resurfaced. As he sat in his office one night, staring at her last known address on a computer screen, Richard finally understood the magnitude of what he was facing. His empire had become a cage, and the secrets he had tried to bury were clawing their way out. The woman who had once cleaned his house had now become the ghost haunting his fortune. And the children who bore his name without knowing it were somewhere out there lost, frightened, and at the mercy of forces he had unknowingly unleashed. The following weeks passed like a storm that refused to calm. Richard could barely focus on his business meetings, his mind drifting endlessly toward questions that never had answers. Every day he expected a call, a clue, something that would lead him to Marisol and the boys. But each morning arrived the same way empty inboxes, unanswered inquiries, and silence from the private investigators he had hired. It was as if Marisol and her children had been erased from existence overnight. The thought of her disappearance pressed on him like a heavy weight he couldn't lift. He tried to keep up appearances, attending board meetings, public events, and interviews, but behind his calm exterior, he was unraveling. Every smiling photo the media published felt like a lie. His assistant noticed his growing distraction but knew better than to ask questions. Only Richard knew how deep the situation went, and he wasn't ready to expose it. He was a man used to solving problems with money, influence, and control, yet none of those tools could bring back what he had lost. The mystery of Marisol's disappearance became an obsession. One night, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Richard revisited the abandoned house where she had lived. The door was unlocked, swinging slightly with the wind. Inside, the rooms were empty except for a few forgotten toys and an old photo of the boys stuck to the refrigerator. The walls still carried the faint scent of cleaning detergent and something floral, perhaps the same cheap perfume Marisol used to wear years ago. He stood in the middle of the small living room, surrounded by the echoes of a life that had been hastily abandoned. The air felt thick, heavy with something more than just dust. He noticed a stack of papers lying in the corner. They were eviction notices and legal documents stamped by one of his subsidiary companies. His own signature appeared on one of them, proof that he had indirectly ordered the eviction without realizing who it affected. The sight of his name on those pages filled him with shame. He had built his empire on progress and innovation, but beneath that surface, there were people like Marisol who paid the hidden price for his success. He folded the papers and kept them in his pocket, determined to find whoever had allowed this to happen. Back at his office, Richard demanded a full internal review of the property acquisition. His staff assumed he was just being meticulous, unaware of the personal reason behind his urgency. He examined financial records, transaction logs, and employee correspondences, trying to connect the dots. After hours of combing through files, one name began to appear too often: Mark Dwyer, one of his senior project managers. Dwyer had handled the redevelopment contracts, approved the eviction orders, and managed payouts to private contractors. Something about the pattern felt off. Richard dug deeper and discovered large, unexplained payments made to outside parties through Dwyer's authorization. The money had been moved through shell accounts with no clear recipients. It looked like corruption, but there was something more calculated about it. These payments were made just days before Marisol disappeared. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The next day, Richard called Dwyer into his office. The man looked confident, his suit crisp, his expression calm. Richard kept his composure, asking general questions about the redevelopment process. Dwyer answered smoothly, showing no sign of nervousness. But when Richard mentioned Marisol's name, the man's eyes flickered for the briefest second. It was enough. That tiny break in composure told Richard everything he needed to know. After Dwyer left, Richard instructed his private investigator to focus on him. Within 48 hours, new evidence surfaced. Dwyer had been working with a group of private contractors known for handling corporate problems, people skilled in intimidation, blackmail, and silence. They were the kind of men who made inconvenient stories disappear before they could reach the public. Richard felt his stomach twist as he realized the full scope of what might have happened. Dwyer must have discovered the connection between Marisol and the children. Fearing a scandal that could damage the company's image and his own career, he had likely taken matters into his own hands. The more Richard uncovered, the darker the picture became. The investigators tracked one of the contractors to a remote warehouse outside the city. There, they found security footage from the night Marisol vanished. The grainy video showed a familiar car pulling up near her house. Two men got out and forced her into the back seat. She didn't struggle. She seemed too frightened, clutching something in her arms, perhaps one of her children's belongings. The footage ended abruptly, but the timestamp matched the night she disappeared. Richard watched the video again and again, his hands trembling. Rage and guilt collided inside him like fire and ice. He had built a kingdom where fear and control ruled, and now it had swallowed the only people who had ever been truly innocent in his life. He felt disgusted by what his world had become, a machine that destroyed anything it touched. But he couldn't let emotion cloud his judgment. He needed to act. He contacted law enforcement discreetly, providing the footage and the internal records that linked Dwyer to the shell companies. He knew that going public would draw attention, but he also knew silence would make him complicit. The investigators reopened the missing persons case, now reclassified as a potential kidnapping. Richard kept his involvement hidden, fearing that his connection to Marisol would become front-page news if revealed. He told himself his only goal was to bring her and the boys home safely, no matter what it cost. Weeks passed before a breakthrough came. One of the contractors, cornered by police, confessed that Marisol had been taken to a remote property owned by a company under Dwyer's name. She was held there for several days while Dwyer tried to determine how much she knew. But then, before he could act further, she escaped. The man claimed they had searched for her afterward, but she had vanished without a trace. Whether she was hiding or someone else had found her first remained a mystery. Richard felt both relief and dread. She was alive, but still missing. The police had little to go on, and every lead grew cold quickly. Dwyer was arrested for his role in the abduction, but even behind bars he refused to reveal anything more. Richard's empire was shaken by the scandal, though he managed to contain it publicly by framing it as an isolated case of corporate misconduct. The world believed his company had acted swiftly to remove a corrupt employee. No one knew the truth, that the woman Dwyer had targeted was the mother of his children. Days turned into months, and still there was no sign of Marisol. Richard began to wonder if she had chosen to disappear for good. Maybe she didn't want to be found. Maybe she wanted to protect her sons from him, from the chaos that surrounded his name. It was a thought that both hurt and humbled him. He deserved her silence, but the children didn't. They deserved better than the legacy he had created. Every year, on the date she disappeared, Richard visited the old neighborhood. The houses had been torn down and replaced with sleek apartment buildings, another project his company had funded. But for him, the place would always be haunted ground. He would park at the same spot where he used to watch her from his car, now a sterile parking lot, and sit there for hours, staring at nothing. He often imagined Marisol somewhere far away, maybe under a different name, working quietly, her boys growing up tall and strong. The idea brought him a strange comfort. It was easier to believe she was safe than to face the possibility that she wasn't. But in the back of his mind, He knew the truth was never that simple. The world he had created didn't let people escape so easily, and if she ever returned, she might not come as a frightened woman seeking help, but as someone ready to expose everything he had tried to keep hidden. That thought lingered with him every night as he looked out over the glowing city skyline, realizing that for all his wealth and power, he was still at the mercy of a single secret, a secret that could destroy him the moment it surfaced again. The days following the shocking DNA results felt like a blur for Richard. His mansion, once a quiet symbol of power and order, had turned into a place filled with restless energy. The silence that usually comforted him now carried a strange echo of guilt. Every step he took reminded him of the truth that 3 children, living in poverty, shared his blood. He couldn't erase the image of their faces, the uncanny resemblance that now haunted him every time he looked in the mirror. The realization that he had unknowingly abandoned them to a life of hardship began to erode the foundation of pride he had built over the years. He had spent decades constructing an empire, yet in his heart something vital had been left behind. While Richard tried to process everything, his legal team worked quietly in the background. They knew that if the truth reached the media, it could destroy his reputation. The image of a self-made billionaire would collapse under the weight of scandal. Richard had always kept his private life guarded, but secrets this large had a way of slipping through cracks. He was torn between doing what was right and protecting what he had built. His advisors urged him to offer financial support discreetly, but something inside him resisted that easy path. He wanted to meet the boys again. He needed to look into their eyes and see for himself if there was still a chance to make things right. Maria, the maid, lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city. Her life was simple, filled with quiet struggles. When Richard first appeared at her door, she was overwhelmed with confusion and fear. For years, she had carried the weight of a past she never thought would catch up to her. The boys Liam, Noah, and Ethan had grown up with stories about their father being away, but never knowing who he really was. They had learned early not to ask questions that would make their mother's eyes fill with tears. Now the truth stood at their doorstep in the form of the richest man in the state. Richard's first visit was quiet but unsettling. He stood there, uncomfortable among the peeling paint and broken furniture, realizing how far apart their worlds were. The boys watched him with suspicion, unable to connect the stranger before them with the father they had never met. Richard left that day with more questions than answers. The guilt began to grow heavier, and with it came a sense of urgency. He started to see the boys not as an inconvenience, but as the missing part of his life. He arranged for the family to move into a better home, ensuring they had everything they needed. But his actions stirred whispers among the elite circles that surrounded him. Old associates speculated about his sudden generosity, and soon, tabloids began asking questions. A photo of Richard visiting the poor neighborhood made its way online, fueling rumors of an illegitimate family. His lawyers scrambled to control the narrative, but the damage had begun. The world that once admired him now started to doubt him. Behind the walls of his mansion, Richard began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Not of losing money or influence, but of losing the fragile bond he was trying to build. He invited the boys over, showing them glimpses of the life they could have had. They explored the vast halls, touching objects they had only seen in magazines. For a moment, Richard felt a strange peace, as if fate had given him a second chance. Yet, in the corners of his mind, he sensed danger. Someone close to him had started digging into the past. His head of security, a loyal employee named Marcus, had grown suspicious of Richard's behavior. Marcus knew secrets about the billionaire that could ruin him, and he wasn't above using them for leverage. He discovered that Richard had indeed been romantically involved with Maria decades earlier, during a time when she worked at his estate. But what Marcus found next changed everything. Maria had been fired shortly after announcing her pregnancy, and there were records suggesting that Richard's assistant had arranged the dismissal quietly to protect the company's image. When Richard learned what Marcus knew, panic set in. He realized that his own empire had been built on more than just business deals. It had been built on silence, control, and buried mistakes. If the truth came out, it would not only destroy his legacy, but also harm the children he was just beginning to know. For the first time, he faced a moral crossroad where money couldn't guide him. He could pay Marcus off or he could face the truth head-on, but before he could decide, something unexpected happened. Maria received an anonymous message warning her that her life was in danger. The message mentioned a cover-up and hinted that the billionaire's world was darker than anyone imagined. She was terrified, unsure whether to trust Richard or run from him. Meanwhile, the boys began to notice strange men watching their home from cars parked nearby. Richard's empire was collapsing from within, and he couldn't tell who was behind it. Every decision he made seemed to make things worse. The closer he tried to get to his children, the deeper he sank into chaos. The guilt that had driven him to seek redemption was now the same force pulling him toward ruin. By the end of that week, the story had reached national headlines. Billionaire's secret family exposed appeared on every news channel. Cameras swarmed Maria's home, journalists followed the boys to school, and Richard's name became synonymous with scandal. The empire that had taken decades to build was unraveling overnight. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was something Richard couldn't ignore. The anonymous warning sent to Maria had come from someone inside his own company, someone who wanted him destroyed. As he watched everything fall apart, a dark realization dawned on him: the scandal might not have been a coincidence at all. Someone had been waiting for years for the right moment to strike, and discovering his children had given them the perfect weapon. The morning after the story broke, Richard woke to a world that no longer belonged to him. The news channels replayed his face endlessly, narrating every secret, every accusation, every whispered rumor that now stood in the open. His company's stocks plummeted within hours. Board members began demanding answers, and investors called frantically, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. The mansion, once a fortress of privacy, was surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Every part of his life had been turned into a spectacle for the world to dissect. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Maria refused to answer his calls. The boys, frightened by the media frenzy, had stopped going to school. Richard sat in his study surrounded by files, trying to trace how the story had leaked. The deeper he searched, the clearer it became that this wasn't an accident. Someone inside his inner circle had orchestrated everything from the leaked DNA results to the carefully timed photos. The timing was too perfect, too destructive. Someone wanted to see him fall completely. He found his first clue when he reviewed company security reports from the previous week. The log showed that Marcus, his head of security, had accessed confidential files, late-at-night files, containing private details about his family. The DNA test and the arrangements for Maria's relocation, Richard's pulse quickened. He had trusted Marcus for over 15 years. He had given him power, loyalty, and a generous life, but that loyalty had turned to betrayal. Still, something about it didn't make sense. Marcus had always been greedy, but this plan was far more calculated than blackmail. It was as if someone else was pulling the strings. Richard tried to reach Marcus, but his calls went unanswered. Hours later, police cars arrived at the company headquarters. Marcus had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. The discovery sent shockwaves through the media, and new rumors exploded overnight. Some claimed Marcus had leaked the scandal, others whispered that Richard had silenced him to bury the truth. Whatever the narrative, it all led back to Richard. His empire was crumbling faster than he could control. Meanwhile, Maria's home became the center of chaos. Reporters surrounded her day and night, shouting cruel questions and digging into her past. The boys were terrified and confused, unable to understand why the man who had promised to protect them had brought danger instead. One night, Maria packed their bags and fled the city. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even Richard. All she wanted was peace, far away from the cameras and the noise. When Richard learned that Maria had vanished, something inside him broke. He realized that money, power, and influence meant nothing if he couldn't protect the people who truly mattered. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. The walls of his mansion felt like a prison, filled with memories of choices he couldn't undo. The guilt that had once driven him now felt like punishment. He spent sleepless nights replaying the past, every moment he could have changed, every time he had turned away from humanity in pursuit of success. Then, one morning, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a single photograph: Maria and the boys in a small coastal town. They looked happy, away from the noise, their faces calm for the first time since the storm began. On the back of the photo was a short message written in Maria's handwriting. "We safe. Don't look for us." Richard held the picture for a long time, realizing that perhaps this was the only way she could protect them from him, from the world, from everything that had gone wrong. But the mystery wasn't over. A week later, Richard received another anonymous message, this time through an encrypted email. It contained documents revealing that Marcus hadn't acted alone. The person truly behind the leaks was someone within Richard's executive board, a man named Charles Kent, his longtime business rival. Charles had discovered the secret months earlier and had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to expose it. Marcus had been used, manipulated into gathering information and feeding it to journalists, only to be discarded when he became a liability. The suicide, as it turned out, may not have been a suicide at all. The revelation reignited something in Richard. He had lost almost everything, but he wasn't done yet. He gathered evidence quietly, piecing together a trail that led directly to Charles. Bank transfers, hidden communications, and internal memos, all proof that the scandal had been engineered for revenge. Years ago, Charles had been ousted from the company after a failed merger, and this was his way of settling the score. Richard handed the evidence to the authorities and then stepped away from the company entirely. He no longer wanted to fight for a reputation that had already been poisoned. The investigation into Charles made headlines, but Richard stayed silent. He refused interviews, declined public appearances, and spent his days in isolation. The world saw a disgraced billionaire retreating into obscurity, but privately he felt something he hadn't in years: a strange sense of peace. He had finally stopped pretending. The empire was gone, the wealth scattered, the power meaningless. But for the first time, he could see clearly what had mattered all along. Months passed before he received another envelope, this one postmarked from a distant town. Inside was a simple drawing: three boys, holding hands, standing beside a tall man. It was drawn in a child's handwriting. Beneath it was a note that said, "We forgive you." Richard stared at it for a long time, feeling something shift inside him. For the first time since the scandal began, he allowed himself to cry. He never saw Maria or the boys again, but he made sure they were cared for in silence. A trust fund was created anonymously, ensuring their future without his name attached to it. The media eventually lost interest, the company moved on, and the world found new scandals to chase. But Richard lived quietly, far away from the noise, in a small coastal town not too different from the one in the photograph. Sometimes he would walk along the beach and watch the sunset, wondering if they were watching the same sky somewhere nearby. The man who once believed he could control everything had finally learned the hardest truth: that life, love, and redemption can't be bought, only earned. His name had faded from the headlines, but his story lingered as a silent reminder of how power can blind, and how even the richest hearts can ache for something as simple as forgiveness.